Our main passage this morning comes from the book of Joshua. Joshua and Israel are in the promised land. They've already taken Jericho. They go up to a little village called Ai, and things go badly. And this is what happens. Joshua is complaining. He's talking to the Lord, complaining about why things went so badly at Ai. The Lord says to Joshua, "Stand up. Why have you fallen face down?" Israel has sinned. They violated my covenant that I appointed for them. They've taken some of what was set apart. They've stolen, deceived, and put those things with their own belongings. This is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They will turn their backs and run from their enemies because they have been set apart for destruction. I will no longer be with you unless you remove from among you what is set apart. Go and consecrate the people. Tell them to consecrate themselves for tomorrow, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are things that are set apart among you, Israel. You will not be able to stand against your enemies until you remove what is set apart. In the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord selects is to come forward clan by clan. The clan the Lord selects is to come forward family by family. The family that the Lord selects is to come forward man by man. The one who's caught with the things set apart must be burned along with everything he has, because he has violated the Lord's covenant and committed an outrage in Israel. Joshua got up early the next morning. He had Israel come forward tribe by tribe, and the tribe of Judah was selected. He had the clans of Judah come forward, and the Zerahite clan was selected. He had the Zerahite clan come forward by the heads of families, and Zabdi was selected. He then had Zabdi's family come forward man by man, and Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, was selected. So Joshua said to Achan, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel. Make a confession to him. I urge you. Tell me what you've done. Don't hide anything from me." Achan replied to Joshua, "It's true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I did. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful cloak from Babylon, 5 pounds of silver, a bar of gold weighing 1.25 pounds, I coveted them and took them. You can see for yourself. They are concealed in the ground inside my tent with the silver under the cloak." So Joshua sent messengers who ran to the tent, and there was the cloak concealed in his tent with the silver underneath. So they took the things from inside the tent, brought them to Joshua and all the Israelites, and spread them out in the Lord's presence. Jesus smiles. What do chewing gum, Advil, cell phones, Claritin, hamburger meat, Red Bull, cosmetics, and deodorant, what do all those things have in common? Other than the fact that you can get all those things at Walmart, right? What do all those things have in common?
They're all made by God.
Retailers say those things top the list of things that are shoplifted every year. Americans annually shoplift more than $35 billion worth of goods from retailers. Men are after computers and TVs. Women are after cosmetics and clothing. And contrary to what we tend to believe about the stereotype, the typical shoplifter is a working professional who has no financial need and shoplifts for all sorts of reasons. Now, some of this has changed in the past year. 2020 was a year for all years for shoplifting. The pandemic created a nation of shoplifters. But it wasn't computers and TVs. It was bread, and baby formula, to the point where some retailers were actually not pressing charges for shoplifting, but simply telling shoplifters, you can't shop here anymore. Because the common refrain is, I did this because I am hungry. You see, people are stealing bread and baby formula instead of computers. Most of us are feeling pretty good right now. We're probably not in the habit of shoplifting. However, employers tell us that $400 billion, 12 times the amount of shoplifting, $400 billion lost in productivity every year because we stand around water coolers longer than we should. We allow projects to go longer than they should. Some of us fudge on invoicing $400 billion in lost productivity due to time theft in the workplace. And if you add on top of that another $500 billion that Americans are cheating out of Uncle Sam every year, there's a lot of stealing to go around. We're in our series, Jesus Smiles. And Do Not Steal makes God's top 10. It's number 7. If you were to draft your own top 10 of offenses against you in any given year, would stealing make the top 10? It makes God's top 10. And stealing is at the heart of the story that we just read. This Old Testament story. You know, Israel's plans for the promised land that God had promised her are almost derailed by theft, by stealing. God leads Israel out of Egypt in a miraculous way. He leads them through the Red Sea. They end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years because of another disobedience. They cross the Jordan River. God miraculously allows them to take a big city called Jericho. And that's a miracle on its own. God actually causes the walls to come down. And they take this big city, Jericho. And they're well on their way to taking the promised land that God had promised them, the land flowing with milk and honey. They get to this little village outside of Jericho called Ai. And they fall flat on their face. They end up running from it. They're routed. In fact, they lose 36 people. They didn't lose anybody in Jericho. They lose 36. And all of this is coming at the hands of, they're being led by Joshua. Joshua is the new leader in Israel. He's replaced Moses. He has big shoes to fill, and it's not going well for him. And Joshua is having a conversation with God. He's had this huge military victory, and all of a sudden, they're at puny little Ai. They get routed, and Joshua goes running to God. He's like, what is up? And if you read the words here in Joshua 7, before we get to the passage we read, Joshua's having this conversation. He sounds a lot like those Israelites. You know, when they were going up against the Red Sea, the Egyptian army is just coming in behind them. They're like, God, you let us out here to die. We should have stayed in Egypt. You know what Joshua was telling God at this point? We should have stayed in the wilderness. What are we doing? And he's basically saying, God, this is on you. Your name's at stake. And God's like, you know about this. We have a problem. We have a problem. One of the stipulations that God had with Israel in taking Jericho was that they were to burn the city, they were to burn everything they came across with fire. Except the precious metals. They were supposed to set aside the precious metals, gold, silver, bronze, whatever they came across, to be used in the tabernacle for worship. It was part of God supplying his worship. So they were to burn everything, they were to set all that stuff aside. And the narrator of the story says that when they took Jericho, as he's telling the story, they burned the city with fire, and they took the bronze, the silver, and the gold, and they set it aside for worship, just like God had asked. Except they didn't. What Israel doesn't know, as it's running away, being routed at Ai, is that somebody among them has been a traitor. Somebody among them hasn't followed the rules. And God is not pleased. So Joshua's doing all this complaining. God's having none of it. And God's saying, look, somebody's made off with the goods. But it's not as simple as that. If you listen to the words of that passage that we just read, he talks about there being somebody, but as he talks about all this stuff, he's talking about Israel. He says Israel has sinned. Israel has not kept my covenant. Israel has taken. Israel has stolen. Israel's deceived. Israel has taken what was supposed to be mine and put it among their belongings. Israel sinned. Israel violated. You see, it's not just with Achan. This is Israel's problem. And then that's the indictment. Those are the charges. God then gives them the worst case scenario. The worst thing that could ever happen to Israel. In fact, this is something that Moses had fought for 40 years earlier in another crisis. And this is what God says, I will no longer be with you unless you remove from among you what is set apart. I will no longer be with you. That is Israel's death penalty. In fact, if we really think about it, that's our own death penalty. What's the worst thing that could ever happen to you? Think of the worst thing you think that could happen to you in life. The worst thing that could ever happen to you or me or Israel in that moment is for God to take away His presence. No more pillar of cloud, no more pillar of fire, no more presence in the tabernacle, no more glory, no more God's presence, no more blessing, no more promised land, I'm leaving. And that's the center of the whole story. That's worse than losing life itself. And how did it come to this? It came to this. And those words we read from God's top 10. Do not steal. That's how Israel got here. See, the problem of theft is sitting in the middle of all of this. There's a lot going on here, but theft is at the heart of this. And it seems like a lot. I mean, we come to this in 2021 as sophisticated Americans, and really? Over stuff that was taken? Are you serious? What we don't realize is that theft, even theft amongst us, even between us, if I take something from Luke that isn't mine, I'm not just stealing from Luke. The way God looks at it, I'm taking from God Himself. Theft against God. And it is out in the open here. You see, what has been stolen is stuff that is supposed to be set aside for worship. Stealing from worship. Stealing from the worship space. Where people are forgiven, where God's life is given. Where forgiveness is given, where the blood of bulls and goats forgives sin. Where God's presence is. Stealing from God. And all theft at some level involves this. Shoplifting, time theft, fudging those IRS forms. It's stealing from God Himself. The image of God is at stake. It's treating the recipient. If I steal from you, I'm treating you as if you are not made in God's image. I'm treating you as somebody that is less than human, I am saying that I have a right to what you have more than you do. This is why Luther, in commenting about this, says, every artisan, shoemaker, baker, butcher, general contractor, everybody should have in their workplace, do not steal. Because stealing is an attack on God himself. God himself is on the line. Stealing has eternal implications. We don't look at it this way. Usually I'm after some sense of personal satisfaction now. I want something that's not mine, but we don't think about it as stealing from God. We forget that God owns all of this. He owns it all. Everything. He owns everything that I have. He owns everything that my neighbor has. The stuff that I want, the stuff that I think that I want. He owns it. That McDonald's burger is God's. Those fries are ultimately God's. Probably haven't thought about burgers and fries that way. We read in the story that the guy that did it gets caught. He gets brought forward. Joshua and Israel figure out, with God's help, it's Achan. And Achan confesses. His words are very interesting. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful cloak from Babylon, 5 pounds of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 1.25 pounds, I coveted them and took them. So he gets very specific. Oh, by the way, they're in my tent. About, in our day and age, $40,000 to $50,000 worth of stuff. But it's the confession itself. His confession mirrors Eve's confession. I saw, I desired, I took. Those are the same words that are used in Genesis when Eve is talking to God. I saw, I desired, I took. And there's a reason why it goes back to the garden. Because in the garden, all that goes down because Eve wants what God has. She wants to be God herself. Adam wants to be God himself. Stealing ultimately then is placing myself in the position of being God. And that is the rhythm of temptation. That is the rhythm of stealing. I saw, I desired, I took. I mean, if we were to unpack any time that we are involved in taking something, and we do this all the time, by the way, stealing has all sorts of forms in our hearts. I see it on the internet all the time. People, manipulation. Manipulation is a form of stealing. I am attempting to steal your time. I'm attempting to steal your joy. I'm attempting to steal your satisfaction. I'm going to impose myself on you in certain ways. It's still stealing. It's still theft. We've all done this. Nobody's off the hook here. We're all takers. We're takers from the moment we're born. How many of you, I think we all brag about the fact that the very first words out of our mouth are supposed to be dad, dad, and mama, right? Or whatever. Mommy, Bobby. You know what? A lot of, if we were honest, you know what the first word is? Mine. 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 Right? Right? We don't have to tell our kids this. We don't have to train them to do this. They do this automatically because we're takers. We're graspers. We're constantly trying to grasp the other guys. We're takers. So we're all this, we don't all live lives of crime. And yet fundamentally, in our hearts, we're constantly grasping for whatever isn't ours. And you can fill in the blank. You know it in your heart. I know it in my heart. That I'm constantly grasping for something that is not mine. We're all thieves. This story ends in a really bad way for Achan. Achan loses his life over this. And the spot where he dies, it becomes a notorious spot. And everybody knows, like I said, everybody knows the Valley of Achor, which is a variation on his name, by the way. His name's Disaster. The Valley of Disaster. But it's not always going to be this way. There is hope. What's interesting, in the death of Achan, Israel lives. And Israel lives and goes on to take the land. They end up enjoying the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The prophets pick up on this. We read it in Hosea. The prophets told his own people that they could look forward to the day when the valley of disaster would be no longer, would be a valley of hope. And that day comes in Jesus. The person of Jesus, Mr. Generosity. Someone who doesn't take, but only gives. Mr. Generosity. You see, God owns all of this. God owns all of this, yet we take our time and our money and our resources and we're always saying mine. Jesus doesn't say mine. Jesus comes saying yours. He exchanges our grift and gives us gift. The Son dies for takers. I mean, after all, God's a giving God. For God so loved the world, He gave His only Son. Giving, 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 giving. Generosity. Giving us what we cannot earn for ourselves, what we cannot do for ourselves. Giving, giving, giving. Mr. Generosity. You know, Paul tells us that the opposite of stealing is generosity. We read this a moment ago. The thief is no longer to steal. Instead, he does honest work with his hands. Why? So that he can give to the person in need. You see, this is what Jesus has done for us. Jesus has been generous with us. We are now to be generous with others. The generosity that comes to us in our forgiveness, and, oh, by the way, all the material things that we have, yeah, our hard work, right? But ultimately, God gave them to us. They are still His. And God says, because I'm given to you, you're to give to others, you're to be generous to others. And so we are no longer grifters, but givers. And it all begins right here. We talk about this often. That the grace, the mercy, the peace, the forgiveness that we receive here becomes grace, peace, and forgiveness for our neighbors here in our community, for others. The generosity that we enjoy right here becomes generosity for the world, becomes generosity for others. That's the rhythm of life. What happens to us here, we now live for everybody else in generosity. We are thieves, but Jesus smiles on us anyway. And He continues to give, and He continues to give, and He continues to give. Even though we don't deserve it, He is for us Mr. Generosity.